Our topic today is Romanesque art. We are staying in Western Europe in the Middle Ages. We've just looked at the early Middle Ages, and now we're continuing on through the Middle Ages to this little section of time, which is called Romanesque. For Romanesque, the easiest way to remember it is that the people of this time borrowed some Roman ideas, and so it's Romanish, and I'll come back to that point and what makes it Romanish. Let me begin with a quote that sets the stage for us. Okay, so on the threshold of the aforesaid 1000th year, that means the year 1000, some 2 or 3 years after it, it befell almost throughout the world, but especially in Italy and Gaul is France, that the fabrics of churches were rebuilt, although many of these were still seemly means beautiful, and needed no such care. But every nation of Christendom rivaled with the other which should worship in the seemliest buildings. So it was as though the very world had shaken herself and cast off her old age, and were clothing herself in a white garment of churches. Then indeed the faithful rebuilt and bettered almost all the cathedral churches, and other monasteries dedicated to diverse saints, and smaller parish churches, and so on. What's happening in this description is that the year 1000 was thought to be the end of the world. And we've had a couple of these in modern times, right? Wasn't it 2006 was supposed to be the end of the world according to the Mayan calendar or something, and people really think the world's going to end. We also had a moment like this, 1999, when it switched to 2000. Everyone thought planes were going to drop out of the sky and whatever. So people get these ideas that the end of the world is coming, and then it doesn't. So in this case, everyone thought the end of the world was going to be in the year 1000, and then it wasn't. And so they were very happy, and they decided to show their appreciation to God by making all the churches more beautiful, by dedicating all these resources to rebuilding churches. And you remember that in the early Middle Ages, a lot of churches had been built under the Frankish kings, the Charlemagne kings, Carolingian kings, and then under the Ottonians and so on, and also the various monasteries that we talked about. So there were already a lot of churches out there, but there was this new movement to make the churches more beautiful. So that's a lot of what we're going to be looking at in this lesson, and actually in the next lesson as well, is church architecture and some of the developments in church architecture. So as I said a moment ago, the Romanesque period is called Romanesque because the architecture in particular is done in the Roman style. So if you look at these two pictures, on the left is an early medieval church. This is the Ottonian church that we just covered. And then on the right is a Romanesque church. What's the big difference here? We're looking at the nave in each case. You can see the nave arcade. You can see a gallery level. You can see a clear story above that. So this 3-story elevation on the interior is similar. The triumphal arch at the end of the nave. The big difference, of course, is the ceiling. The ceiling on the left is a flat timbered ceiling. The ceiling on the right is vaulted, and it's made of stone. That's the innovation in the Romanesque period, beginning just after the year 1000. When people began to rebuild churches, they began to experiment with vaulting again, just like they had in Roman architecture. That technology had been lost for some time. they begin with barrel vaults, and then they eventually develop more sophisticated vaulting, including groin vaults, and we'll trace that development. All right, one of the big kind of motivating factors at this time period was pilgrimage. And what you're looking at here is a map of Europe during this time period. And you'll see the Holy Roman Empire as was established by the Ottonians, the Ottonian kings, and before them the Carolingian kings. So large parts of what are today Germany and Italy and Switzerland and so on in the Holy Roman Empire. And then to the west of that, the Kingdom of France, England, Spain, and so on. Okay, but the lines on the map, those black lines, show the most common pilgrimage routes, especially the ones that led to the Church of Santiago de Compostela in Spain, which you see all the way in the northwest corner of Spain. So pilgrimage became really important at this time, and it was inspired by several things. For one, it was inspired by the wanderings of Christ. So Christ went on various long trips, and so if you wanted to be Christ-like, you could also take on a trip like that. There was also the desire to worship at special holy places. So certain churches were desirable to worship at, such as the Church of Santiago de Compostela, because that was the burial place of Saint James, one of the apostles of Christ. So it was a sacred place. So the desire to go worship at sacred places drove pilgrimages. And also something called the cult of relics. Let me break this down for you. Okay. So the desire to visit and worship at holy places, the wanderings of Christ. My list is a little different than this list, but that's okay. The cult of relics. What is a relic? A relic is a sacred object, something that's usually connected to Christ or one of the saints. And I've talked about these before when we were looking at Islamic art, because I mentioned that oftentimes the Crusaders, who were these Christian soldiers from France, would travel east to the Holy Land to wage the Crusades, try to regain the Holy Land from the Islamic Empire and put it back into Christian hands. And while they were there, they would pick up religious, I guess we can think of them like souvenirs. And these might be things like a piece of the true cross, or the shroud of Turin, or the bones of a saint or a martyr. And these objects were then placed in jeweled boxes, usually, which are called reliquaries, and then they would be placed in a church, oftentimes back in France. And then people would want to pray to those relics. So there were places that you'd want to go and pray to, like the Church of Santiago de Compostela, but there were also places that were made special because of the relics they held. So a lot of the churches along the pilgrimage route that I just showed you, and we'll look at some of these more, like Conques and Vézelay, those churches were stops along the pilgrimage route because they had important relics, and the pilgrims would want to stop at each church and pray to those relics. In a way, they're kind of like the icons in Byzantine Christianity, where you would pray to an image, and that object became kind of this powerful intermediary between the person and God. Okay. Okay, so relics were really powerful. And then the fourth point on this list is the granting of indulgences. And I don't want to go too much into this, but it was something that was happening in the church in the Middle Ages where you could kind of buy your way out of sin. And you could do a penance by going on a relic, but you could also purchase an indulgence and so on. So there were traditions associated with these pilgrimages. Okay, so what you're looking at here is an example of a reliquary. It's the golden statue that contained some of the bones of Sainte Foy, which is the French name for a saint named Faith. And you can see it's gold and it's covered in jewels, and this golden statue would sit at an altar in a church, and then you could go and you could pray to it and be very close to the bodily remains of this church. This one is from a church at a place called Conques in France. And you have to also look at this and realize how much this is like a pagan cult image, right? It's a golden statue that people were praying to. It reminds me of that golden calf in the image that we saw, where the faithful were warned specifically in the Ten Commandments against worshiping graven images, and this is very much like one of these, pagan graven images. But I guess old habits die hard. So these relics and reliquaries were very important in the Middle Ages. Okay, so there were certain focal points for pilgrimages. I already mentioned Santiago de Compostela in Spain. Jerusalem, of course, was a major pilgrimage destination, and that was a big pilgrimage to take, obviously, to go all the way to the Holy Land. Rome was another important destination, and then there were all the churches along the way. So what I want to do now is just look at a few of these pilgrimage churches with you and look at the development of the architecture and also how the churches changed to accommodate the pilgrims. So this is a very early example. If you look at the date, it was built just after the year 1000, and this is a church in Spain. We're looking at the nave of the church. It's very narrow. There is a nave arcade, but there's no gallery, and there's virtually no clear story. There's a couple of windows up there, but it's not a regular well-lit clear story. And the whole nave has above it one big barrow vault, right? Like one big long arch, kind of like a long tunnel. So this is a very simple, straightforward way to create that high vaulted ceiling. Now, why did they want to do this? Why did they go to the trouble and not just use the flat timbered roofs? Well, there were a couple of reasons. One was that those wooden roofs could catch fire, and when you have candles burning in a church, that's a risk. So wooden roof churches were at risk of catching fire. The other reason was that the builders and the people who wanted them built were seeking to make their churches mirror their sense of what the heavenly city of God would look like. They wanted these places to be inspirational, and the way that they were going to achieve that sense of being heavenly was by seeking height and light. And I want you to remember those two terms because they really define the goals of both Romanesque and Gothic architecture. Gothic will be our final topic. Height and light. So they were trying to achieve height by putting these high vaulted ceilings instead of just a flat roof. The challenge, though, was that at least when they started, it was hard to bring in light. And if you go back in your mind to when we first started talking about the arch, when the Romans started using the arch, the whole principle of the arch is that each one of the, if you think of an arch made of stones, as these are, each one of those stones is pressing against the one next to it. So if you cut a window into it, you are compromising the structural integrity of the arch. The same goes for a barrel vault. So it's challenging to put windows into a barrel vault. It makes the vault unstable. So that's why if you look at this church, there's that bright window at the far end. And then there's some ambient light coming in from the aisles. And then there's just a couple of windows up at the top letting in light. So this would not be a really bright church. It's also not that big, right? It's high, but it's narrow. And they've also had to add this, what's called a strip buttress, that extra strip of stone, like a belt. And there's multiple ones of these stretching down the nave. Okay, so they're after height and light, but they're challenged to do both. So this is kind of step one. Let's do a nice high barrel vault, and we'll try to poke a few windows in there where we can. All right, this next one, you're looking at a drawing of it. This is the Cathedral of St. James at Santiago de Compostela in Spain. So this was one of these important destinations for pilgrimages. This is the burial place of St. James. And we're looking at the drawing of it, well, for a couple of reasons. One is because the church has been changed many times over history, and it doesn't look exactly the same anymore, and I want us to look at what it looked like originally. The other reason is because by looking at this drawing of the exterior, we can really see the structure of it. And Romanesque churches are characterized by something that's called Romanesque readability. And what that means is you can look at the outside of this church and you understand exactly what it looks like on the inside in terms of its structure. That's very different than Byzantine churches. Remember how we would look at the outside of a church like the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, and it was just a confusion of domes and half domes and buttresses, and you don't know what's going on. It was so complex. Romanesque tends to be very straightforward and readable. So here, for example, you can see the nave and then the transepts, which is this crossing part. We're looking at the eastern end. The apse is closest to us. The western end, which is furthest away, has two high towers. This is a carryover from those Carolingian and Ottonian Westwerks, that high towered western front to the churches that we saw in the early medieval period. If you were to enter at the west end, sorry, I'm trying to give you a lot of information at once without being able to point at things on this slide. Okay, so this church is also really characteristic of a pilgrimage church. And I guess what I want to explain is that pilgrimages became so popular that they had some of the same problems that highly visited tourist sites have today. You know, places can get really crowded when a lot of tourists go there. And that would happen at some of these pilgrimage churches. They would just be swarmed with pilgrims. And so, you know, what do you do? All these people show up at your church to pray. You have to kind of find a way to move them through and then move them on so that more people can come in. So they created a kind of internal pilgrimage within the church so that there was a path to follow inside the church and things to see along the path, and then you would sort of be moved out like a long, endless line of tourists. So if you entered at the western end by one of those high towers, you would proceed along a kind of an aisle, a route around the exterior. Sorry, it's the interior, but around the perimeter of the interior. So up the side aisle of the nave, around the transept, and you can see this in where the roof is lower around the edges. That's actually showing you the path that you would walk. And as you come to the east end, which is what's facing us, you see those little kind of half round, almost like mini towers that are jutting out from the walls of the church. Those are called radiating chapels. They're radiating because they're coming off of the sides of the building, and they're little chapels so that as you went around the church along that pathway, you could stop at each one of those little chapels, and each would hold something special, like I don't know, I'm sorry, my concentration totally distracted. My dog is out here chasing squirrels. I'm sorry. Okay, so each chapel would hold something special, like the relics of a saint, or maybe it would be the tomb of a bishop that had been important at that local place, or maybe there'd be an important piece of art. So each chapel would have something special for you to stop at and pray at, and you would make your way around the altar, around the church, and out the other side. Let's look at this from a plan view. Okay. So here's the same church. We're looking at the plan. So at the bottom is the western part, the entrance where those two towers were. So if you imagine going in there and then going up, let's say the right-hand side aisle and around that transept off to the right, and then you start to hit the radiating chapels, and you stop and you pray in each one, and you continue around the ambulatory in the apse. The ambulatory is the walkway, and there's more chapels there. Now I should say that at this point we've been calling this an apse in a church, that eastern end. And I apologize, but we are going to start calling it the choir. I know we think of the choir as the people who sing in a church, but the choir is another architectural term for this kind of elaborated eastern holy end of the church, the apse, what we had been calling the apse. So the ambulatory takes you around the choir and then around the other transept and down the other side aisle, so that you have a pilgrimage within your pilgrimage church. And if you imagine lots of people just being herded in one door, around, and then out you go, and you can go outside and buy a souvenir, find a place to stay that night, get some food, just like you would if you were a tourist today. The other little drawing here shows you the cross-section of the church, where you can see the central nave with that high barrel vault. Just like in the older church we looked at, it's one single barrel vault. Now, in order to make this larger, because this is a big church, that barrel vault has to be supported. They haven't figured out how to make it just stand up on its own. It's being supported by that second-story gallery that's above the side aisle. And looking at it in this cross-section where it says galleries, if you look at the roof of the gallery, like the top part, that's acting like a buttress. It's propping up the weight of that big vault. Now, this means, however, that there's no clear story, and it is, therefore, a little bit dark in the church, because you're getting some ambient light from the windows in the gallery and the windows in the side aisle below, but there's no direct light coming into that central nave. So this was the trade-off. They got this big, roomy church with a high vault, but not a ton of light. And I want to show you what it looks like on the inside. Okay, here we're not looking at the nave, we're looking at one of those transepts, the T part, because it retains more of the original architecture. A lot of the rest of the church has changed. So here you can see what it used to look like, that you have that, notice the big barrel vault up above, and then no clear story, just the gallery, which looks awfully dark, and then the aisles below with some ambient light coming in from the windows. Now, there is a lot of light coming in from the tower at the crossing and from the ends of the transepts, but there's no light kind of flooding the interior. So that was their trade-off. I think I should pause to break this up a little bit because I've gone on a bit. So let me stop here and then I'll give you like a part 2.